Welcome to another episode of the Tree Planners Podcast, Tuesday, September 9th. I never say the date at the beginning of these things. But welcome. We're joined as usual, not always, but usual, by my colleague Margaret. And we're also
almost
joined
always here. What are you talking about?
And we're joined by Jonathan Scott, the new executive director of the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition. So thank you very much for joining us today, Jonathan.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So, Margaret, you in the green room, you kind of gave a broad kind of scope of what we're hoping to get at today.
Yeah.
You want to give that, and then I'll just jump in right after that and do our kind of usual plea for likes and subscribes and all that jazz.
Yeah. Well, happy to be joined by Jonathan today. I've known you now for, I'm going to say about 4 or 5 years. Does that sound about right? Maybe a little less. As your tenure at Bradford West Gwillimbury Council. And what we're hoping to do today, because Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition has worked very closely with the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition, it has been a mainstay of environmental advocacy for the lake for many, many years. And so there's a lot of people within our podcast and within the community that want to make sure that, that the future of the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition is personal, right? And not in a sticky way where we're going to grill you. So what we're hoping to talk about today is a little bit about who you are, where you came from, a little bit about the challenges Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition is facing, some of your public service, how we can approach these things, and then a little bit of future forecasting, I guess, is what we're hoping. And what you will notice, Jonathan, is we are a very professional, very polished podcast here. So expect nothing but a 10 out of 10 experience on this.
Okay, great.
I'll throw it back to you, Adam.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, we generally leave this to the last moment to ask, usually just because I forget. But we're getting better at asking earlier on in the podcast. So if you like the podcast, if you like what we do here, it's pretty easy on most platforms to leave a 5, whatever star ranking. I think on Apple.
Preferably 5, otherwise
5.
Move on.
Yeah. Hey, no, we love, and even bad reviews, as long as, it'd be nice if at least they're constructive. Let us know what you'd like more or what you don't like, whatever. We love that stuff. It helps us grow. So go ahead and do that. That helps other people find the podcast. So, other people who might be interested in environmental issues in sort of central Ontario is kind of our more focused basket, but Ontario generally, Canada, and then we even get into some global stuff every once in a while. So if you like our take on that stuff, do what you can to help get our word across.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Jonathan, for those that don't know you, what are some things that we should know about you?
Well, what a broad question and where to start.
I know. It's like, tell me about yourself for an interview, right?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Bradford and moved home about 5 years ago, and my predecessor had passed away about 5-6 months into COVID, and I had found myself in a by-election to replace him on town council. Academically, career-wise, lawyer, MBA was my training, but I've always worked as a consultant or in government, and those roles often brought me into environmental NGOs in terms of management and communications and helping lead advocacy campaigns, whether in government where we were getting to work on environmental policy or for ENGOs through consulting. And so over my time on Bradford Council, I've tried to have a real green bent to my politics and my policy, and we've managed to get some really interesting, innovative local projects through with, I think, a real focus on protecting water. So when Claire announced she was going to step down as executive director of Rescue Lake Simcoe, I originally called her and said, "Well, who are you thinking is going to replace you?" And the more we started talking, the more we got into a place where she encouraged me to apply, thinking a part-time role, part-time counselor. There's some synergies there, and it would be a good fit. So that's the dry version of who I am. Uh, I'm a diehard Leafs fan. I love hiking. I love swimming, and I do love kind of disappearing into nature, whether it's a hike or jumping into a lake. So yeah, like I said, that's the dry version of who I am.
You must be a very emotionally resilient person then, being a Leafs fan,
Yeah,
because
well,
you guys are
this
going
sets
through
me
it.
up for disappointment.
So coming from Bradford, obviously, Lake Simcoe is personal for you. Like it's, you grow up in that environment. It's always right there. Bradford's pretty sort of intimately connected to the lake. What are some of the sort of experiences or connections that you have to the lake?
Yeah, so we're kind of on the southern tip of Cooks Bay, but the Holland River flows right through town. The south end of town is, of course, bordered by the Holland Marsh. Um, Personally, I mean, much of my first hiking was at Scanlon Creek Conservation Area, which is, sort of, I guess it's a little over 300 acres of forest and wetland just off of the Holland River, just south of Cooks Bay. Uh, but in high school, I remember through student council and other roles pushing RMP that climate change was an existential threat to our generation and the ones coming after us. I remember thinking it's great that we have community litter cleanup days, but what about the unbridled growth we're experiencing? And so in my time on council, I've tried to have a balancing act where we focused on smart growth, and much of the density we have happens in my ward with infill projects or condos. A more walkable, transit-oriented community. The GO train stations in my ward as well. But that growth that we've seen in Bradford from not always making wise decisions means you have to have a preventative approach and a reverse engineering approach today. So, a simple thing that we've done is these litter traps that you can put into older storm basins that don't have filtration, and it takes out sediment and plastics and, to a lesser extent, salt pollution into the river and lake. But it's a cost of $30,000 to do 90 of them, and the pilot works. So why wouldn't we scale it up? But I point that out because that's a smaller piece. We also have to get right wastewater treatment and growth policy and stopping sprawl and growing in a smarter, slightly denser, more transit oriented way. We've got an on demand, fully electric, app based bus system now that I should have looked the stats up before, but I think it's taking us from 30,000 rides a year to something like 90,000 rides a year, which is huge in a community of 50,000 people. So, to your question, Adam, I think it's this tension between provincial growth mandates and a constantly evolving planning framework with provincial legislation changing. Some bad decisions that were made going back over the past quarter century that let Bradford sprawl, but then trying to protect what matters and fix or reverse engineer or at least mitigate or prevent worse things from happening. And it's complicated because we're creatures of the province and they have their frameworks for growth, they have their growth targets, they have their infrastructure that they want to build. Um, but we've also kind of been this hole in the donut between Simcoe County and York Region where we kind of get forgotten by both. We don't belong to York Region and we don't really fit in Simcoe County anymore, which just adds insult to injury and makes everything a little harder.
Mm.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, but so how's the don't really fit in Simcoe County? What's that?
We're so much more urban, we're younger, we're more
Oh,
diverse.
okay.
Um, so in my first term, the county made a bunch of cuts to library services and basically said, well, how many multilingual books do we need? Well, we needed about 90% of them in Bradford.
Right.
Hmm. Right, which is distinct. Then I think a lot maybe people might think then, well, what if Barrie or Orillia in these, but they are actually separate already from
Yeah,
Simcoe County.
exactly.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it's more similar to Barrie and Orillia than it is to the rest of the communities in Simcoe
And
County.
some of it's almost comical. There's a perennial debate around yard waste pickup. Bradford needs it because we have townhouses and subdivisions. You don't need it if you can take it out back and burn it or compost it
Hmm.
in your backyard. And that's a funny one, but it also is a real tension to people who move up from the city into a townhouse development in Bradford and are just baffled by the fact that they don't have this service.
Hmm.
But then again, like why would a rural property in Springwater want to pay for a service they have no use for?
Well, we get yard waste pickup.
Yeah, but not
So
as much as
maybe not as much, but it is funny though, that urban rural divide. And working with colleagues down in Toronto, some of the provincial policy that comes down, they're like, I don't understand how that would even like make sense. And or the fact when the ice storm came, as an
right.
example, trying to talk to people about like, well, people really needed their pickup trucks. Like, what do you need a pickup truck for in this day and age? I'm like, do you know, like getting a trailer to you have, it's just really a disc. It doesn't mean that everybody needs a pickup truck, but the idea that there's no place for it anymore because you can just take it in your car. And I'm like, okay, except you just lost a 80-foot tree in your backyard and now you need like how are you taking all of that? And they're like, oh, we never really thought of that, because they're thinking of branches and then the city will do the rest. And I'm like, no, there's a real disconnect there. But anyways, I digress. I'm curious about where you mentioned about being on school council. So obviously public service has always been in a bit of your blood, I would say. So like, where do you think that comes from? Or where, not that I'm going to get all Freudy on you and everything, but um, where do you think that piece of you stems from?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I was on student council. I was a student trustee as well. I think I was on a colleague's podcast who's a counselor in another town, and he pointed out that I'm a pastor's kid, and apparently pastors' kids either become Jessica Simpson or politicians. And
You decided not to
his,
become the Jessica Simpson.
I don't have the bone structure, but they his contention was you go into entertainment or you go into public service because you've been raised in a community where you have that role in a different sense in my case in a church, but I'm sure it's true of other faith organizations. I think there's probably some truth to that. I also am a bit of a shit disturber, I think, for good. Uh and I've always been passionate about trying to fix things. It's why I wanted to go to law school. It's why I work as a consultant. I like delving into a problem and trying to fix it. And so much of the problems that we experience have some sort of root or connection to government. And I didn't actually ever think I'd run myself. I thought I was more of a backroom type, but I like how much in a small town in municipal politics where it's nonpartisan, it's about community first and being available to people, your neighbors, and accountable to them because they can find you at the grocery store or out for a walk in the morning. Uh, and in that respect, I do sort of see the connection back to the church environment I was raised in, where you know you think of older small towns in the UK where the parish vicar and the county council were often this one and the same.
Right.
And I don't mean this that I think I have some sort of self-righteous, so I know best. It's more about, I think, being raised in a community, a small town, and then having a chance to give back to it with, some of the skills that I acquired in the time that I didn't live in town.
Mm-hmm.
I was out of town, so to speak, for about a third of my life, but have come back for the past 5 years or more, and getting to sink my teeth into downtown revitalization, which was a problem the whole time I was growing up. Our downtown isn't friendly for business and restaurants, etc. But then also some of the other problems that have emerged. It's fun and it's fulfilling.
Mm. Well, also too, those faith-based communities tend to really think about selflessness, right? How are you part of something bigger than yourself? So, I mean, as bad of a reputation politicians have, a lot of them go into it for the right reasons, right? They want to see something different or better. My question.
Actually, Margaret, can I just, you made me think of something. A lot of my faith also came from summer camp in Muskoka.
Mm,
And so that was at a time when the headline news version of religion was gay marriage bad, but I was being taught more about um, anti-poverty and selflessness and humility and caring for the environment and stewardship. And this is probably the most I've actually spoke about faith in a really long time. It's not something I often speak about, but that idea of stewardship and responsibility for one another, it's somewhere in there.
yeah,
Meaning, when I say in there, in me.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Well, just consider us like a Barbara Walters, modern day Barbara Walters. We get you to talk about the things you won't go anywhere else to talk about. Just kidding. I have one more question, and then I'll throw it back to you. When you're talking about politics and government, you also worked at the provincial level in the premier's office. And what did that teach you about public service, but also the problems that you're now facing at a different level, if you will, or a different component of government? What did that experience? You're like, oh, those were some key learnings that I got from that about how change happens, how to be effective in your community. Pick any of those.
So I worked for the first year and the last year with a gap in between, filled mostly by law school, for Ontario's first female premier. And so at the beginning, when it was exciting and new, and Premier Wynne was taking over from Premier McGuinty, and she was going to be more unabashedly progressive and perhaps even more aggressive. And then that coming back and seeing how she'd been caricatured and vilified, and the die was already almost cast leading up into her reelection. Within a year or two of Donald Trump unexpectedly beating a more qualified female opponent for the first time. So a lot of what I thought about at the time working at Queen's Park was more around women in politics and how you have to be two times as good, do everything backwards and in heels, uh, and the double standards that were faced. Where I mean, with Kathleen, who I know is now on your board, she had to deal with not only misogyny but homophobia, and it wasn't there in 2014 when she won a majority because everyone kind of felt this is cool. But then it came back with a vengeance once people decided they didn't like X, Y, and Z. And, that government and that premier, I think, had a really strong sense of morality and what they wanted to achieve, but kept getting limited by the system and the barnacles the party had collected at that point, and just how hard it is to get big things done with very little money. And we've seen a government, love them or hate them, under Doug Ford, that came in wanting to be a conservative change. And I think a lot of conservatives would say, oh, Doug's kind of moderated and mollified himself. We might disagree with moderating in some respects, but he's not the bull in a china shop he was in the first year. And I think that's just a sign that the institution of government kind of grinds you down, and you're almost a victim of the position you have at that level. But the main lesson I took away as someone who has an activist bent but will wear a suit to do it sometimes is you've got to have a really, really clear sense of what your values are, but you have to be willing to say good enough is good enough. And I'm going to take this win and make a mental note that I'm going to go back for more next year. And that translates at the local level in municipal politics so well, because I can get good enough done pretty well on a daily basis, but you can't compromise that good enough today isn't the proper full solution that you actually want to say, what you want to see over time.
That's the what is it? The saying, politics is the art of compromise, or
Yeah.
that. I don't really remember who that was.
everybody just knows it as anonymous.
Google it. Yeah, I mean, it does seem to make sense, but this is also kind of in the direction of something that I was curious about. So, uh, how um, this is a little bit of a hammer and nail question. How how do you understand sort of the positives of government? What like if I think about the political discourse that we have, so much of it is centered around uh, a lot of the things that government does as negatives or as causing problems or what have you. And it's an overly broad generalization, but um, but there's a lot of things that we sort of just take for granted, and as such don't recognize that they are there because government has put them there. Thanks to government, I mean, we hate it when our roads are shut down for construction and whatnot, but we love it when, or we like to have roads. They're there, and we don't. People get pissed off with. People seem to be generally kind of frustrated and annoyed and angry at government, but so much of what we actually have in our lives that enables our high quality of life, and certainly historically, I don't think anybody's ever had it better than we do, is in large part due to government. So how do you kind of think of that tension, and how, I guess my next question would be, how can you identify those kind of small subtle successes of government and sort of help people see them and perhaps celebrate them a little bit better?
So my mind as you were talking went to two things. One is the movie Babe, where the pig becomes the sheep herding dog. Well, somebody says to the talking duck, "That's just the way things are," and he goes, "Well, the way things are stinks." Um, and then the other thing that came to my mind is the Churchill quote about democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest.
Yeah.
Uh, and so between those two, the way things are stinks and it's the worst except for all the rest, I think there's a lot of truth. At the local level, I get to see impacts much more directly. You read some of higher figures, and Obama, for example, loves the day he passes Obamacare, but then is helpless to prevent gun violence because he just can't get a bill that seems so common sense through Congress. And our discussion about working for the Wynne government, I think that government was hampered by kind of almost trying to do too much at once and never actually telling the story of what they were actually doing. Um, at the local level, I mean, I can open a youth center and a week later hear from a mom saying, "Oh, my 14-year-old loves it. It's fantastic. Thank you." I can, visit a park and say, "I don't like these three issues," and it'll be fixed by the end of the month. Um, you know, getting I have the older end of town, getting roads repaved matters to the people on that street. And some of the environmental initiatives, I mean, getting to stand in a field with a farmer who says these buffer strips that are going to help eat up some of the phosphorus runoff before it hits the waterway, I think is the coolest thing. I'm into it, but I had no idea that every other farmer was going to want to come take a look and say, "Oh, that's cool. I need that too." And so I think there's a almost like a version of positive peer pressure that happens at the municipal level, where some of the work we want to do with Rescue Lake Simcoe is to start scaling up those best practices that individual municipalities do. But if every watershed community had litter traps on their old stormwater basins or buffer strips on every farm rather than on a pilot project basis, there are actually small things that can deal with phosphorus pollution or some of the other challenges our lake has in a kind of like when we talked to COVID, that you have layers of Swiss cheese in terms of prevention. You can sort of do the same environmentally. But there's a quote, and I think it's Max Weber who said, "Politics is the hard boring of hard boards." So like, turning wood into boards. it's a lot of grinding, but I think what I've learned to love at the municipal level is you actually do see from people right away. I mean, even some of the more scandal stuff. There's a minor scandal in my town right now about, did the mayor tell the truth about the proceeds of his golf tournament? The amount of people who have come up to me in the past week since this happened to say, thank you for insisting on accountability and transparency and value a bit of a watchdog role. It's pleasantly surprising. And, I think even city councilors in Toronto would say that, direct to the people, you know, if you can't solve my problem by the end of the day, what good are you? Well, you can often solve the problem.
Right.
And so that closeness is what makes it meaningful, because you do hear from people that you got the good thing done, or in the reverse, you haven't yet, you better get on it.
Hmm. It's funny that the tension that Adam was talking about. I remember one of our first conversations via the phone. Um, you had said to me, I understand. We were talking about the Bradford bypass, which we won't get into today. But it's been a perennial issue. Um, but we were talking about how we see the issue differently. And you had said, it's okay. I know you guys have a role, a function
Yeah,
in society is to push beyond what's politically feasible, politically possible, what politicians want to do. And I think the hard part from the activist point of view, and I'm sure you're well aware of this too, but is that you end up being more on the goose side from Babe, or the duck, whatever it was. I thought you were
the
going to
duck.
use that'll
Yeah,
do, Babe. That'll do. That'll do, Pig. I thought that was when I was like, how is he going to pull that in? But anyways, um, you end up being pulled more to that. It's never really good enough. It stinks. Like you know
yeah,
what I mean? Like, because, and I think it's an important tension that has to maintain, because if everybody just accepts, the status quo as it is and what's possible and feasible, then you're never actually figuring out how to make the system better. The feedback loop of those existential crises you're talking about, we never really get at the larger process conversation. The litter traps is a good thing. It's a wonderful benefit, but there's still the concern about what's happening overall with the lake and how it's responding to climate and everything else. So you have to have that tension there. But I did like your how you described being in the public and being able to get things done, because I always think municipal government has a really difficult time. I see it from the outsider's point of view, of like you're at the end of the pipe where you don't have the resources necessarily, or the ability to control the purse strings as much as you want, and you get a lot of the services that are frontline dealing with people's livelihood,
right.
their businesses, their families. And there's this tension, and I saw it. I was at Oromadante on the weekend, and the mayor and deputy mayor and a councillor were there speaking to a ratepayers association, and they're like, but you should be changing this, and they're like, but that's not my job, like like this is outside of my jurisdiction, I can't change provincial policy, you know what I mean? Anyways, I guess what we should do is transit to Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition.
Sure.
So you've come in with all of this public service, advocacy, thinking about the environment, a lot of experience in politics. Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition has been known, it's a charity, but also has a very strong advocacy voice, especially under Claire. She never really shied away from a difficult conversation, pointed, sharp op-ed. So where do you see that? How do you see that transition happening under you?
Well, just to link a few things, I think we've talked about this before, Margaret, but Premier Wynne was the one who, as an activist who became a politician, taught me, and I think she's mentioned to you, your job as activist is to convince me and then go help create the political environment so I can do what you want me to do.
Hmm. Yep.
And that's sort of how I approach Rescue Lake Simcoe. There are bright spots across the lake that we've alluded to some in my own municipality, but how do you scale them up? How do you prevent the original sin of a lot of the issues our lake is facing, which is unbridled growth, sprawl, impervious surfaces, more phosphorus pollution, more salt pollution, when A, the growth's already happened to a certain extent, and B, the provincial policies are to increase the growth. And so I don't want to be playing a game of trying to manage a decline. We need to have changes at the provincial level that recognize that development per se isn't a bad thing, but it has to be sustainable development. It has to be done in a in the way that we know works, which is denser, more transit oriented, not just gobbling up farmland because it's cheaper and easier. The amount of pressure right now to open urban boundaries and just sprawl out onto another, in my case, 1,100 acres of farmland, we have to resist it. And then when we do build new subdivisions, they have to be done in such a way that the creek or the stream or whatever remains a park conservation area, a good buffer, and the neighborhoods themselves are constructed with low impact development and walkability front of mind. And the building code, goodness knows why heat pumps and practical things like rainwater barrels or even solar panels aren't part of how we build homes. Most developers I know are kind of proud in their product, and they're builders in a literal sense, and they want to be able to show off what they've built. So why don't we work more with them at the provincial level to insist that they're building according to what is industry standard in Europe in terms of sustainability? So, I think activism and advocacy is about creating a permission structure for political figures to do the right thing. Sometimes it's educating them on what the right thing is in the first place and persuading the public to insist that this is not optional. So, we're working on some internal improvement pieces at Rescue Lake Simcoe right now, but we're also aiming to launch a pretty landmark report on the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, federal, provincial, and municipal efforts to reach those goals and where we stand. Because, you know, um, since 2009, most of the indicators have worsened or stayed the same. There's a couple of modest successes, but the challenges we're facing are it's a lot of one-offs that don't level up to a central strategy. The phosphorus recycling plant that I fought for, along with Councillor Dave Neeson and Georgina and a whole bunch of others, is a really good thing. It could actually deal with about 10% of the phosphorus pollution on an annualized basis once it's built. But how does that level up to a strategy if we're also approving sprawl in most of the municipalities in the watershed? We're doing a lot of whack-a-mole is one metaphor. I guess the other metaphor is what's that line about dilution is the solution to pollution? Well, we're not diluting it. We're actually adding more pollution.
Right.
So, I always come back to the province dictates that the municipalities grow. It has looser environmental standards under this government than previous. And then it leaves municipalities holding the bag if there's not the infrastructure, and infrastructure is more expensive if it's all to serve sprawl. The year you build a road is the year you have to start saving to rebuild it in 20 years. So to go back to the way things are stinks, we're setting ourselves up for financial and environmental failure because of ultimately the growth plan for this region. And I'm not anti-growth. I consider myself a YIMBY, but done properly
Mhm.
with the things that made the ward I represent a place people wanted to live, where you had laneway flats for grandma and a nice big home with a yard out front. Or most of the eightplexes and sixplexes and fourplexes in Bradford are in my ward because in the 70s people knew this was a good affordable way for people to enter the market. Condos near the GO train station, I think, is our next big housing product. All this to say that there's these isolated solutions at the municipal level. There's some, like the phosphorus plant, good capital projects from the province, but I would say poor policy. And then at the federal level, it's oddly been this mixed bag where the Harper government had more funding than the Trudeau government, but terrible environmental policies. The Trudeau government had decent environmental policies, but no funding. So hopefully this federal government gets the balance right, that you need the good policy and the good funding. And that's what this report we're working on is going to try and speak to, is to say the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan remains best in class for how to have integrated watershed management and a strong, smart strategy. But you've got to fund it and you can't undermine it.
Hmm.
I was I was thinking. So you've mentioned smart growth, and then I was also thinking about as you were talking about development and how that needs to be done in a more sustainable, smarter way. Uh, that too often it seems to be presented as almost like a zero sum equation,
Hmm.
where if you're going to have development, you're going to lose farmland or habitat or what have you, because you're going to need that space of land to build on. But that's not at all the case, and that's not even actually zero sum if you think about it, because where the development would go, if it's farmland or forest or what have you, that's space that an ecosystem that actively contributes to our quality of life. And once in on a year in and year out basis, once you lose that contribution. So it's actually a net negative. But well, I guess you could play with the metrics on the other side of that. But anyways, you get my point. But it doesn't at all have to be the zero sum equation that we're too often presented with. So that smart growth conception, you've been talking about sort of complete communities, walkability, things like that, and how all of that kind of feeds in to not only the affordability of the community, but also the quality of life. Can you speak a little bit to some of that, and some of perhaps the successes? You alluded to them already, the successes that you've had in your tenure on council, and kind of what you so most people will probably understand, and you sort of sketched out a little bit where the location of Bradford is right sort of next to Lake Simcoe, basically, and these waterways that flow through Bradford and empty into
Hmm.
Lake Simcoe. So it's a really crucial location. But so uh, you know, what are those successes that you've had to date, and then maybe what's your vision for that area in the future, and its relationship with Lake Simcoe?
Yeah, I like the way that you frame that, because the geography is kind of destiny.
Mm.
Uh, so my ward is the older end of town. It's the part of town that was here when I was a kid, right by the Holland River, a portion of the Holland Marsh, the old downtown core. And in the 70s and 80s, they built the set of Stranger Things in terms of, 70s and 80s style subdivisions around the downtown core. So when we're doing gentle density or infill development, it's because an older home on half an acre or an acre gets torn down, and we can put in 40 stack townhouses or an 8-story condo, what have you. And that's adding more people into the neighborhood. Most of actually our growth has kind of frozen post COVID in Bradford. We used to do 800 homes a year. We're more like 300. A lot of that's happening in my ward because the infill development is cheaper for the developer and for the town, because all the water, wastewater, electrical servicing is already there. It already has a road out front. It already has a park next door. And so I've been part of, with our Parks and Rec team and our developers, in revitalizing every older park in the older end of town, because we've been able to leverage the monies from the infill development to say, well, let's give this park a facelift. Let's take the old cool change rooms and turn it into a youth center. $400,000 worth of renovations later, that building's got a new lease on life, and kids can go to the youth center. Um, One of the challenges we're facing is because growth is low, development charges have been this cash cow, and I was the only member of council to vote against raising them by 11, 12% last week. And I did that on the theory of housing's unaffordable enough. We agree that development charges ultimately get passed on to the home buyer, whether a young family or a senior downsizing. And you can't get something from nothing. If we're not building enough homes, to fund the capital assumptions we have, we're not going to make that up by raising the charges that we're using that are helping distort the market and adding $100,000 onto the purchase price of a $800,000 home that's now suddenly a $900,000 home, which is too much for a house, incidentally. Um, so it's all this real challenge because municipalities get most of the needs that the public sees on a day-to-day basis, but less than a third of the funding compared to the federal or the provincial government. Um, but I think we're also showing in my small part of the world that you can have gentle density and it helps enhance a community. It's not this big scary thing to have a fourplex built in an existing neighborhood. It just means four people have more modest homes than their neighbors.
Mhm.
And we're certainly such a diversifying community that there's an element of not everyone wants a single family home with a white picket fence because they have generational living.
Mhm.
So we're not perfect. I'm not perfect, but I think we've had a good experiment, and sometimes I've had to fight um, to get this through on council. And in the case of TCs, I was the only one who voted against. But you know, good environmental policy is also good affordability policy. It's good community building as well. People want parks and trails and transit. So, I call it smart growth. I know it's a term, I didn't coin it, but I call it smart growth because I think it calls out the question that this is smart and doing things that are more coordinated and integrated and being able to see those connections and not make foolish, short-sighted financial decisions because you're listening to the wrong interests. That's the definition of smart in politics, in my opinion. Barack Obama famously said that his foreign policy mantra was "Don't do stupid shit," and I wish more municipal politicians had that tattooed on their foreheads.
And both of their hands so they could see it when they started to write notes. And it's funny because a couple of things came up when you were talking there, Jonathan. One, this idea of how we grow now, as far
Mhm.
as like the suburban, it's an experiment. We haven't been growing communities like this forever. And in fact, our older communities, like you were saying, did start, before the car became like a really big thing. You have these old downtowns and places where they've got retail and living situations above them. They had smaller, like, this is such a thing where I think the Western minds, if you will, North American minds, have think like this is how we've always done it. And I'm like, no, actually, this is this is not how we've always done it. And this experiment is quickly becoming so expensive, so stupid that I see many municipalities around Simcoe County that have huge amounts of infrastructure deficit. They don't know how they're going to be able to pay back for the infrastructure to the developers. Like it's become this huge
Vicious
cycle.
circle.
It's just going down and down. And the other thing that I think is funny when we talk about walkability is that when you think about it, most people choose walkability when they go on vacation. Even if you go to Canada's Wonderland, okay? You're
Yes.
going there and you're walking by stores. People love that there's benches, there's trees, you get everywhere. You go to an all inclusive. You even go to somewhere like Europe. Like people are generally picking places where they can just walk and relax. And why, for example, would Canada's Wonderland set up around walkability? Well, because they know when people are strolling, they tend to stop into store, they spend more money, you set up a bench right outside, and you're like, oh, that lemonade looks great. So it's not only just walkability, isn't just a matter of like good environmental policy. Humans tend to prefer walkable communities. It's a less stressful thing. Economically, it does better for small businesses. There's a documentary that I loved, which I don't know if either of you have seen it, called The Human Scale.
Yeah.
And it talks about how we build at the scale of the car now, which is fast, big roads, has lots of problems for safety, has lots of problems for economics, because if people are driving down your main street, unless you know where you want to stop, like, unless there's a destination, you're probably not stopping. So, anyways, all that's to say, I find it all very interesting how some people talk about smart growth and walkability like, well, we've never done this before. Ugh. Like we actually need to kind of go back a little bit of how certain jurisdictions have been continuing to build and also
Yeah.
how we used to build.
That's
Um,
interesting because I was listing the environmental and the economic benefits. It's my sister who's the doctor. You're hitting the health benefits and the society benefits. Um, is the Mediterranean diet good for you, or do Italians and Greeks walk everywhere?
right. Right. It's hard, and that's the thing when we with the co-benefits of all of these decisions. What you're saying about smart growth is that it's not something that's filtered through one lens. Like this
Right.
is good because it's going to give us good money. Well, okay, it's going to give us an economic benefit, but how does it do for other metrics, right? And so I think smart growth gets to the point where the metrics all are the good enough, like you were talking about. They're not all going to be perfect, but you start to see across the board now these are all pretty good versus
Hmm.
one being great and the rest of them are just tanking. Right? Like that's how I feel we've been approaching growth for a long time. So just I know we're getting close to the end, and Adam has some questions for you, but I'm wondering, thinking about going forward with Rescue Lake Coalition, what are some things that you're really hoping to? I know you talked about small scale things at municipalities, but what are some hopes that you have for the coalition in your time that you're going to be with them?
The organization itself, or the impacts
Yeah,
that we want to see?
either, both.
Um, so I think a part of my mandate is to make us or maintain. I mean, Claire kept the organization as a central part of the conversation, and I want to maintain that. And how do you scale that up a bit and make it a very credible voice that government can't ignore? And part of that is by being assertive, and part of that is by being thoughtful. And how do you blend the two together? Because I think you need both as an activist advocacy organization. I do have a bit of a mandate from the board to focus on the grassroots and community engagement and rallying support around practical solutions. I think there's some fatigue about just fighting the Ford government. And don't get me wrong, we have to fight the Ford government when they're wrong. I didn't expect to be fighting the federal government in my first month because they're musing about cutting the Freshwater Action Fund, but we're fighting them on this. Uh, but having those practical things that governments can say yes to. You know, Claire was talking about in deciding to step down that she had a lot of banging her head against the wall moments,
Mhm.
and I'm going to have some of those too. But if there are things we can get the governments to say yes to, and that can build momentum, I I think that's where I would try to bridge what Adam was talking about in terms of so much of the politics and the public service I engage in is very, very practical. What can we get done? What's good enough? Well, how do you do that with more of an activist bent of you should do these things, you should also fix the underlying problems, and we're going to hold you accountable? So that's the kind of tension and synergy between the two roles.
So it gets a little bit at another question I had sort of almost right at the outset, which is maybe to get a little bit of your experience on both sides of this aisle in government and in advocacy. And I how do you frame things so that elected representatives want to take that next step, right? I mean, there's lots of competing pressures, I think, including electoral pressures, and there has to be sort of the public sentiment, as you also spoke about, creating that possibility for change in the public sphere. But then there's economic, there's other practical matters. But sort of broadly, how do you think that things are framed in a way that makes them most palatable to elected decision makers?
I'm probably one of the youngest members of council in Simcoe County right now. I'm definitely not the youngest, but I'm in the younger cohort. And when I look at people my senior who have been in the role for longer, the thing that I've heard from the ones that I respect the most is, you're going to have things that you wish you could have a mulligan on, but never have a decision where you feel you compromised your values, because it's just not worth it. The public will see through it and hold you accountable, or you'll regret it. And it's not going to be worth it in the long run. And I think that's such good advice in any job, but especially when where integrity and accountability is central to the mission. And you can only gain progress at the speed of trust. That means being trustworthy in the job. I also think, you know, approaching a role where there is the public fishbowl aspect, I lean to being more transparent, not less. And it's the second time I'm going to quote Churchill, but he famously said, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." Well, I think I get good coverage, so to speak, in town because my Facebook page has almost as much reach as the newspaper. And I've cultivated that because people know they're going to get the straight goods and it's trustworthy. And sure, it's my perspective or my bias, but I kind of own that. I don't think I'm a dumb person, but I'm too dumb to maintain a lie. So I'm pretty transparent that way, and I don't have a good poker face. If I don't like something, I probably won't might bite my tongue, but I'll try and say it diplomatically. And has that got me into scraps with the mayor around the council table? Yeah, it has. When we disagree, it's because I think something has offended something in my ethical framework. Because we kind of generally agree on, well, I was going to say we generally agree on a lot of policy, but there have been flashpoints there too, especially on the growth issue and the financial responsibility side. But in thinking through those tensions you're going to have around the table, fighting for the sake of fighting is just foolish. But when you have actual disagreements, the thing I've learned is don't be afraid to do them respectfully and diplomatically, but you don't gain anything from going along to get along.
Hmm. I think that fighting for the sake of fighting also maybe gets at something that Margaret was getting at a little bit there too, or in like advocacy activist circles, there's just this almost reactive. Everything's kind of a problem, and there isn't much focus on the constructive solutions and the things.
That's such a good point. And I meant to say this earlier. I think it's good to be suspicious, and it's good to scrutinize. One of the things, I woke up this morning to a actually I woke up and 4 hours later there was a letter to the editor saying I showed political courage voting against raising development charges from a housing affordability advocate. And I know that area of activism has a really deliberate strategy right now of not simply shaming politicians who do things they dislike, but actually giving kudos to the ones who do, because it can be lonely when you stick your neck out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's something, I think you touched on something that Adam and I is a pretty strong backbone of what we think our coalition needs to be as far as the materials that we put out. We try to not be bombastic for the sake of being bombastic. And I think we can sense the tone now in some of the activist circles is like everything's falling apart every single day, and like this, if you don't do this, it's going to all fall apart. Like there's this is the worst thing ever. And I've always believed, and I agree with you, Jonathan, about when you become trustworthy, not because we're easily agreeable, but because we're going to do the work to make sure you know where we stand on an issue. We're going to do it with integrity. We're going to use evidence. It's not going to be just because we feel so. It's going to be based on like, here is exactly why we feel the way we do. And one of my early experiences with a counselor in Springwater was we were writing a motion together. This is before SCGC. And he said, you just got to make it something that I can say yes to. And I'm like, yeah, but what if we disagree? He's like, then you got to understand me well enough to understand what's important to me so that there's something in there that I can say yes to. If you make it so that I can't say yes to this, like you're just starting out. And so what we have really tried to do is say, how do we have conversations that don't just flatten it into good guy, bad guy? And similar to what you're saying about the exhaustion, I think there was quite a period where we were stuck with going from a win government where we felt, okay, ideologically, we're mostly aligned, but we still have some issues. And we were like, good on this, not great on this. But then we kind of went into like, oh gosh, everything's just topsy turvy here. And we got stuck in a moment of, we need to protect, we need to stop. And but we always did it with integrity, always did it with, like, we didn't lie about people, we didn't do ad hominem attacks, we didn't try to make it so like everybody realized he's the bad person, like a certain counselor. And I think that sometimes makes it harder. But now I have municipal politicians and MPPs who will come to me saying, "I know we don't agree on this, but let's talk it out. Let's figure out. Can you help me with this? Can you help me understand why this thing is going a certain way?" And then the people that do agree with me are like, "Okay, Margaret, like, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think about this? Is there a group that you know of that has this type of research? Is there some resources that you have that could help me support this motion?" Like, those sorts of things, that the trustworthiness comes back, because we're not trying to make anyone look bad intentionally, but we're always going to be true to the issue. And if you fall on the wrong side of the issue, it's not personal.
Mhm.
It's just that we differ around this particular issue.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I see it around the council table. I sit between a Bradford born and raised Dutch chemical engineer raised on a farm who considers himself an old fashioned Tory. But values wise, we have more that we can disagree with than not, because we care about the environment and heritage and fiscal responsibility. And ironically, on my left is a young, he's a few years older than me, but a comparatively young veteran who went as Pierre Poilievre for Halloween. And yet he's voted for virtually every environmental initiative I brought forward, because we talk like adults and I explain it to him from my perspective. And he goes, "Yeah, but what about this? What about this?" Well, would you be willing to do this so it's just a little bit easier for me to say yes to? And on most occasions, we're able to find common ground there. And, he and I get a kick out of telling people in our various political tribes, you won't believe how well we get along and how much we're able to get done, because we treat each other like human beings rather than, frankly, the way they treat each other in Ottawa, where you're two sword lengths apart and who can rage bait the most for social media.
Absolutely.
Well, at the end of our podcasts, we have 3 questions that we ask our guests. So the first one is, what advice would you give a young person who wants to make a difference?
I've been a young person who wanted to make a difference. I'd say be courageous, be fair, and be relentless.
All right. And how do you think about failure, and how do you respond when it happens?
Uh, I'm very glad Ryan Johnson made the only good sequel to the sequel to Star Wars, because it can let me quote Yoda: "The greatest teacher failure is." Uh, I was a hot-headed, arrogant SOB at 21. The failures I had at 22, I think, helped me become a better person.
Hmm. And what's something you've been enjoying recently? It could be a book, a podcast, a song, just something that's kind of lifting you up in your day-to-day life.
The book I'm reading right now is a trilogy of Cormac McCarthy's Border Trilogy. Um, and I also went back. I'd never watched Yellowstone like cover to cover, so I was doing that at the same time, and both kind of have a cowboy dynamic. Um, my sisters were kind enough to create nieces and nephews, so playing with them in the pool all summer was a huge highlight. And no pressure on me, and you can give them back to their parents at the end of the afternoon. But yeah, I podcasts, I will disappear for an hour and a half walk or hike with, you know, hacks on tap, Pod Save America, The Rest is Politics, Ezra Klein or Malcolm Gladwell. in my ear, and I find that a lot of fun too.
It's good to have outlets.
Yeah. What about Margaret? Quickly,
What?
what's something you're listening to?
Listening to? I listen to a lot of music. I have a pretty wide taste in music, so I have.
Quickly.
Jesus! I am listening to an audiobook, Say Nothing, which has been really
Oh,
good.
cool.
Yeah.
And I'm also reading Circe, which is a book about the goddess Circe, but I can't remember the author's name. So,
So
there you go.
I'm the classic music that you listen to at 14 to 17 is still your music. So for me, it's like Sufjan Stevens, Death Cab, the Mountain Goats, like real indie kind of folky,
Hmm.
Bon Iver even. Like I'm still a 17-year-old girl in my music taste.
Nice. Yeah. Well, getting back to the Jessica Simpson theme there. Um, yeah, Circe's an incredible book. She does another one, and I don't remember her, but she does.
I can find it.
Achilles. I
Yeah.
mean, anyways, um, I've been into. I love Shield of the Republic. It's a kind of. There are a couple of old neocons, which is totally initially was foreign to me, but I think it's a great stabilizer for me in this kind of like really weird foreign policy world we've got right now.
Hmm.
Um, all right. Well, yeah. Thanks again, Jonathan, for joining us. And
Great.
again, if you enjoyed this podcast, leave us a rating on whatever platform you're using. Subscribe, and you'll get the new ones coming out. We're generally here on Tuesdays. Margaret, sometimes joins me as well. It feels like it.
I think I've missed one or two. What the hell?
All right. Well, see
All
you
right.
next week.
See you
Bye.
next Tuesday.
Okay.
Oops.